Trev's Hockey Show. I'm the Trev. That's too sweet. Anyway, continuing with my review of every NHL outdoor game. Well, anyway, up to this point. And today, we find ourselves talking about the 17th outdoor game played in NHL history, or the 6th Stadium Series game, or the second of 4 games in 2016, or the second outdoor game for the 2015-16 season. However you wish to look at it, that's where we're at. And much like the last game we talked about, right here, this one is also about a good rivalry, or at least had that rivalry kind of feel, even though only one of the teams in this game has been in the league at this point for only 16 years. So, for the first of 2 Stadium Series games this year, we're going to talk about the Minnesota Wild hosting the Chicago Blackhawks. So let's talk about it. Alright, so this edition of the Stadium Series takes place on February 21st, 2016, as being played at TCF Bank Stadium in Minneapolis, Minnesota, home of the Minnesota Golden Gophers. So if you remember when we were talking about the 2015 Stadium Series, how the NHL was thinking of hosting 4 games for the 2014-15 season, but thankfully they narrowed it down to 2. Minneapolis was on their short list, and obviously it carried over for the 15-16 season, and here we are in Minneapolis playing an outdoor game. Now, in terms of venues, this is the second time the NHL has gone the way of the college/university venue. The first time, obviously, being the big one at the Big House in 2014. Now, in terms of attendance, some 50,426 spectators took in this game, which, in terms of the attendance records, puts it at the 10th highest attended outdoor game, putting it just over the Rangers-Islanders Stadium Series game from 2014 and just under the Stadium Series game of LA versus Anaheim. Now, in terms of the teams, this is the Minnesota Wild's first NHL outdoor game in, like I said at this point, their shortened 16-year history, whereas with Chicago, this will be their 4th outdoor game in team history, but also their 3rd in 3 years. Now, this certainly won't be their last outdoor game. Chicago in outdoor games is as constant as ice in the rink. It's inevitably going to happen. Temperature at game time was 35 degrees Fahrenheit, or 2 degrees Celsius if you speak Canadian. Now, as far as the rivalry feel is concerned, on top of these two being division rivals, the Wild and the Blackhawks have really been fierce rivals with one another at this point since 2013. Now, if you want to go longer, again, you can go back to the existence of the Minnesota Wild in the NHL in 2000-2001, when, they were in the same division then. And, the hope was, with Minnesota re-entering the league, that Chicago/Minnesota would get back to how the Blackhawks and the North Stars would used to play hockey with one another. And the hope was always that it would be invigorated to that point. Now, we say 2013 because that's really when they started having consistent playoff matches with one another. And it really didn't help that the Blackhawks went through the Wild in 2013, 14, and 15, winning 2 Stanley Cups along the way. So there's that pill to swallow, right? So when this game was announced, it would be another yet one of those rivalry games, and I'm going to say that for every outdoor game for the 15-16 season. It was all rivalry based. Not that that's a bad thing. So with all that being said, let's talk rosters. So again, for Minnesota, this is their first outdoor game. So for a lot of these players, it's also their first outdoor game. But it's not to say that they're not without players who have played outdoor games. I mean, Jarrett Stoll, for example, played with the Oilers. Jason Pominville and Thomas Vanek both played with the Sabres. Devin Dubnyk would get your start And the Wild are coached at this point by John Torchetti, who only took over as interim coach 8 days before this game, making him the first coach in NHL history to make his home debut with his team in an outdoor game. Now, interestingly enough, sticking on John Torchetti, he was Joel Quenneville's assistant from 2007 to 2010. So that's worth noting, I would think. But let's talk Chicago. So as I've mentioned, this is Chicago's 4th outdoor game, having played in the 2010 Winter Classic, the 2014 Stadium Series, and the 2015 Winter Classic. So the roster at this point is pretty much the usual suspects. I mean, you got Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews, Andrew Shaw, Duncan Keith, Brent Seabrook, Corey Crawford, Nicholas Hjalmarsson, and Michael Roosevelt all still left over from the 2015 Winter Classic. Now, Corey Crawford will get your start in net. And the Blackhawks are still, at this point, coached by Joel Quenneville. So, let's talk jerseys. Alright, so Minnesota essentially kept this one pretty simple. I mean, throw on some vintage white just to make it look different. And yeah, keeping it simple really seemed to work for this jersey set. One of my favorites. If you remember, I just did a video about re-ranking the Stadium Series jerseys. This one I ranked up pretty high. I mean, it's a nice look. And it looked even better on the ice. Let's talk Chicago. Now, I've always said this is the best looking Stadium Series jersey ever made. And I'll die on that hill. The collar is pretty neat. You got the 4 stars lining up the collar. I mean, other than that, it essentially is your basic Blackhawks jersey. Just it looks a little bit different for the better. Like I said, one of my favorite outdoor game jerseys. But there's those. So with all that being said and accounted for, let's talk about the game. All right, so both teams came out the gate fast, and not just with shots, but with the hits as well. And that lasted for at least the first 3 minutes. But again, like all things, that would come to a change. Matt Dumba would score his 9th of the season at the .325 mark off of a series of rebounds, initially with Ryan Carter and Justin Fontaine setting up the play to make it an early 1-0 Minnesota lead. And that's a hell of a way to chase the shot. I mean, yeah, a rebound goal is still a goal. It doesn't matter if you take 1 whack at it or 3 whacks at it, but yeah, a goal's a goal, and a rebound goal counts just as much. So obviously the Blackhawks would definitely like to get that one back, but they would get a little bit clumsy along the way. So Philip Deneau and Matt Dumba would both get called for matching interference penalties at 5:17, but Dumba would get the extra 2, or Deneau would get the extra 2 minutes for roughing, effectively putting Minnesota on the power play, and it wouldn't disappoint. Thomas Vanek would score his 17th on the season at the 7:10 mark on a tip-in from a point shot set up by Jason Palmerville and Mike Riley on the power play to give the Wild a 2-0 lead. And that's not even 10 minutes into the first. It's hard not to think the Blackhawks in outdoor games are just going to be Chicago's bad luck ticket. Of course, to be fair, Corey Crawford was completely screened on this one, so behind by 2. Now, obviously, you'd be seeing Chicago start to play a bit more on the physical side until they got into more penalty trouble, as Jonathan Toews would have called for interference at the 10:15 mark. Now, it would have been 2-1 on this play, but because there was already a delayed call and puck went in after it was shot, it would have been a Duncan Keith goal. It got waved off, but the power play would only result in shots. That was it. So not even 5 minutes later, Minnesota would put Chicago on their own power play, as Zach Parise would get called for cross-checking at the 15:07 mark. But much like the Wild's previous power play, the results are pretty much the same for the Blackhawks. So after some more solid back and forth, Chicago would finally give the Wild yet another late power play, as Brent Seabooker got called for holding at the 1908 mark. And really, aside from that, that's pretty much the first period. So Minnesota enters the second period on a power play. And not only did the Wild lead on the score sheet, but they also outshot the Blackhawks 11-9 in the first period. So while Chicago is playing physical, as is Minnesota, nothing's really working for the Blackhawks thus far. But we are only 20 minutes in, so let's not get too pessimistic, right? On to the second. So the second period started off much like the first period, but just a bit quicker. Now, both teams did start out fast, just like in the first, but Minnesota got the play they needed. Nino Niederreiter, yeah, that's quite a name, would score his 11th on the season at the 2:26 mark on a nice shot from the right side of Crawford from Eric Holla and Jason Pominville to give Minnesota the early in the second period 3-0 lead. And that was all Chicago's fault. I mean, not covering Niederreiter at all. They paid for it. So after some more back and forth play, the Blackhawks would take yet another penalty as Corey Crawford, of all the people you could call for a penalty, got called for tripping at the 6:37 mark. So here's another game first. Crawford would become the first goalie in outdoor game history to get called for a penalty. So there's that. This game is setting off all kinds of firsts. Obviously, though, the resulting power play would really result in nothing. I mean, we would get more Blackhawk chances along the way, and more Minnesota Wild chances, but Dubnyk was playing the best game of his career at this point. And that became a bit evident that Minnesota was taking this game to the bank, as Jason Pominville would score his 9th of the season at the 10:26 mark off a slap shot from Nino Niederreiter and Eric Holla to make it a 4-0 Minnesota Wild game so far. Poor Crawford. The defense has given him nothing. I mean, they're just letting him dry. Poor guy. And about 2.5 minutes later, the Wild will give the Blackhawks their second power play of the game, as Ryan Carter would get called for roughing at 13:15. And after that penalty expired, both teams would become a player short, as Michael Roosevelt would get called for a 5-minute major for interference and be given a game misconduct at the 15:14 mark. Now, for Minnesota, this meant that Jason Zucker, the recipient of said interference call, would not be returned to the game. And rightfully so. That was a pretty nasty elbow or headshot, depending on what kind of perspective you're looking at it with. And, just to round out the whole 1 minute that was the 15-minute mark, Mikko Koivu would get called for slashing at 15:48, thus putting the Blackhawks back on the power play. But for the next 4 minutes, we get more shot attempts from both teams, but the period would end at a 4-0 Minnesota lead. Now, Chicago would play a more competitive period than they did in the first, but Minnesota would still lead in shots, 12-11, so outshooting them by 1. And as for Corey Crawford, well, this would be the last you'd see of him playing in this game, as he was pulled, ending the second to start the third, and replaced by Scott Darling, who, well, we'll talk about his performance in this game, I'm sure. As for Minnesota, though, their defense is solid. It's like a brick wall in this game. With Dubnyk keeping the door shut, the holes in the Blackhawks' defense have really started to rear their ugly heads. But with all that being said, let's move on to the third. Alright, so third period. Second verse, same as the first. Well, maybe only 1 second faster. Minnesota, again, would start the scoring in this period early. Ryan Carter would score his 6th on the season on a nice backhand shot off the pass for Marco Scandella and Jared Stoll at the 2:25 mark for a very convincing 5-0 lead. At this point, Chicago might as well just pack it in, right? I mean, everything's going in. So for the next 10 minutes, we were treated to some good rivalry hockey. We had no whistles other than the usual offside or puck in the net or the TV timeout, but lots of opportunities on both sides in that 10-minute frame, with Darling making sure to keep the doors shut, and with Devin Dubnyk being, well, doing what he's doing the entire game. He's doing Devin Dubnyk things right now. And no sooner that I said that, the Blackhawks would actually show some life. Now, Patrick Kane would score his 35th of the season at the 12:05 mark on a weird angle shot from Trevor Van Riemsdyk and Jonathan Toews to finally put the Blackhawks on the score sheet to make this a 5-1 Minnesota Wild lead. But I'm sure if Dubnyk had only been just a little bit faster, he might have had that. But it's really hard to contain Showtime, especially on the bad angles. Now, we would get our only penalty call of the third period, but also our last penalty call of the game, as Andrew Shaw and Ryan Carter will both get called for roughing at 13:15. So we would get some 4-on-4 hockey for the littlest of bits. It could have quite possibly been a 4-on-3 if Chicago didn't already have the net empty. But Erik Haula, coming down the point with the Chicago net empty, would be awarded his 7th goal, unassisted on the empty net, for a 6-1 Minnesota Wild lead. Now, here's why he was awarded the goal. Because the net was empty, and because Erik Haula was tripped up by Patrick Kane on his way to scoring an empty net goal. The rules state that it's an automatic awarding goal. And yes, that is another outdoor game first, a player being awarded an empty net goal. So for the next 6 minutes, we got to watch more shots and maybe just a slight hint of the Blackhawks attempting to make something called a comeback out of all this. But Dubnyk, he was keeping out everything to this point and not giving an inch, not sparking a budge. Ultimately, it would be Dubnyk and the defense, which helped Minnesota go to the 6-1 win. Now, Chicago would outshoot Minnesota 12-9 in this period, but that only brought the total shots out for both teams to 32 even. Now, what a game. Let's have some closing thoughts on it. Well, if we thought the 2016 Winter Classic was lopsided, this one had it beat, but only by one. And despite Chicago's game plan, whatever that was, whether it was come up fast and take the body and get the shots where you can get the shots, why you can get the shots, if that was their game plan, it just wasn't enough. Minnesota outplayed Chicago very evidently and very easily, which in turn gave the Blackhawks their 2nd straight outdoor game lost. Now, for the Wild, the mantra must have been score early and score often, because that's what they did. Now, for John Torchetti, making his home debut with his coach, with his team that he's coaching now, and his home debut resulted in a Stadium Series win, that's impressive. Now, Devin Dubnyk played a solid game, which, is also only complemented by the defense he had in front of him. But, you got to remember, the goalie is the last line of defense in all things, right? Now, having said that, as far as team records and the outdoor games is concerned, as mentioned, this is Minnesota's first outdoor game, so they find themselves in the one game played, one win column. But this isn't Minnesota's last game, I can promise you that. And as for Chicago, well, outdoor Chicago just stinks. 4 games and only 1 win, and that was in a Stadium Series game 2 years ago by the calendar dates that we're recording on here. Early newsflash or early spoiler. If you haven't seen any of the other games Chicago's in, they don't do well there either. But overall, like I said, I like this game. So having said all that, let me know your thoughts on this edition of the Stadium Series. It's another one of them Trev's hockey shows. I want to thank you for tuning in. Don't think I don't appreciate the gesture, especially if you've made it to this point. And if you have made it to this point, I strongly urge you to hit that thumbs up button. Come on, it helps me more than you know. At least let me know you were here. At least let me know you're saying hey. You just want to say you're digging what I'm doing. That thumbs up, it goes a long way. That red button that says subscribe all over it, come on, you know you want to. I know you want to. The algorithm knows you want to. So why not jump on? For everybody who has jumped on, just know that I am eternally grateful for each and every one of you. So there's that. And if you want, there's that link in my description down below. That'll take you to my Facebook page. Feel free to join that. It's free. I'd love to build an audience there. So moving forward, as far as the Stadium Series is concerned, well, we've got one more Stadium Series for 2016. So be on the lookout for that. But either way, in the meantime, in between time, be looking for more some Trev. Later.